I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about archetypes. Now, if you're not familiar with what an archetype is, it's very simply put a character that most people recognize, or a type of character. We're going to get more into depth on that, of course, but that's really what it is. It's very basic. Now, we have to start breaking that down, of course. Is an archetype a trope, or is it a stereotype? No. An archetype was the idea of archetypes was kind of created by the philosopher Carl Jung. And in it, he determined that there are like these different recognizable patterns of characters that we create in our stories. And he broke it down into 12 parts and said, these are the kinds of characters that we are used to seeing, and they kind of show up in every story. Now, other people have expanded upon that. Joseph Campbell is very famous for his books about a hero with 1,000 faces and the power of myth. And he talks a lot about how stories, are a reflection of our society and our world and our culture, but they're also a reflection of us as humans and our psychological makeup and how we work. And so we put those kind of things into stories, and those show up as archetypes. Now, that doesn't mean that just because there's one kind of archetype that every character that is this one archetype is going to be just like that. They're all so different and varied, and every author has a different spin on it or a different way of playing around with it, which I think is really interesting. And there's also genres that it's kind of expected that there's going to be archetypes. For example, in fantasy, you expect to see your hero, whether he's a reluctant hero or he's a gung-ho hero, you expect to see a hero within your stories. And when you don't have heroic characters in kind of other genres, sometimes it feels a little off. I remember I had a professor who was really obsessed with the movie Rushmore, and he made us write a paper on who the hero of the story was. And I really struggle with it because there isn't a heroic character in that movie. And that was very frustrating to me because I like heroic characters and I like the strong heroic character. So I wasn't okay with not being able to figure out who the hero was of that story. Some people love that movie, not knocking it, just saying it wasn't my cup of tea, but also it didn't make sense to me. Like, what do you mean who's the hero of the story? There is no hero. And that was very frustrating. Just to clarify, because I mentioned tropes and cliches, a trope is very typically what a reader expects to see in that genre, or, in the beat of even the story. We say love triangles are a trope. They happen so much. They're not bad. They can be written really well, but they're a trope, and cliches are almost phrases, things like you're like, oh, of course the girl fell for that, the bad boy. Of course that's what happened, And I think we kind of roll our eyes a little bit more at cliches. Tropes are expected, cliches just feel old and tired. So let's get a little bit into what the 12 archetypes are. Now, I'm going to be reading off of a piece of paper kind of off the side of the camera because I do not have them memorized. So the first one is the sage. At least in my list, the first one's the sage. This is typically an Obi-Wan Kenobi type of character. They've got a lot of wisdom, Gandalf, that kind of thing. They have certain interesting things about them, but the sage. Then we have the innocent. I think of Cinderella. That's the first character I think of. Very innocent-like character. Doesn't, things happen to them that are really terrible, and that makes you want to root for them even more. We've got the ruler, which just by the name, kings and bosses. I think her name's Miranda, the woman in charge in The Devil Wears Prada. Very much a ruler type character. And I know people think of kings, but I think that anything that kind of is somebody in charge is kind of that archetype. We've got the creator, which is Willy Wonka or Mr. Lemoncello from Mr. Lemoncello's Library. The kind of interesting They usually have a little bit of an eccentric personality, typically. Then we have the caregiver. I think a very good example of this is Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. You know, he takes care of Frodo. That is his life's mission. Not only is this his friend, he feels this desperate need to care for Frodo, but also to take care of the quest itself. We have the magician, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's magic involved. Sherlock Holmes is a kind of magician type character because he can kind of do these really amazing things, even though he's just using intellect and the power of the mind. We've got the classic hero, which could be anything from Conan the Barbarian to Jason Bourne, and even one of my favorite characters is Alana Trebond from the Lioness Rampant series by Tamora Pierce. Then we have the rebel. Katniss Everdeen is kind of one of those characters, somebody who kind of goes against the flow and starts a rebellion or, you know, whatever. See a lot of those characters in dystopian sci-fi. Then we got the jester. The jester could be Jack Black's character from School of Rock. It could be Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. Kind of your fun character. We got the lover. I think of Porthos from The Three Musketeers as kind of this classic lover character, you know, kind of swoons and sweeps women off their feet and kind of thing. And we got the orphan. And the orphan is Oliver Twist and Harry Potter. And if you write those down or if you look those up, you'll recognize so many characters just by looking at those different archetypes. You'll say, oh, this is this character and that is that character. And so you might be wondering, though, how does that work? You know, how do we create and use archetypes in our writing, you know? And so I'm going to use an example here of a really good book. It's called 45 Master Characters. It's by Victoria Lynn Schmidt. It's kind of broken up into parts, but she includes some characters. She doesn't use the 12 that are I think it's called a Jungian. It doesn't use those 12 archetypes. She kind of creates her own using different gods, you know, Hestia and Aphrodite and things like that. Aphrodite would be the lover. And she kind of breaks it even down by like men and women and the different kinds of characters. But the interesting thing, and I'm going to kind of read it a little bit because I want you to understand what she's kind of done here, is that so this one here is Isis, the female messiah and the destroyer. She kind of describes what that character would be like. The messiah is the archetype of androgyny. Both the male and female version of the archetype are identical, except for the fact that the male preaches and shows the way to love and enlightenment, while sometimes the female is the way to love enlightenment. Then she breaks down, what does the female messiah care about? What are the different things that motivate them? What do they fear? So the female messiah might fear people will be led astray for those who are on the wrong path by their own desire to please. Other things that you might see, or either good or bad, there's no in between for them. They see everything in black and white. And then she breaks it down into how you can develop character arcs for them, their assets, their flaws, and then also how that character can also be bad. So that's the destroyer. You know, the same kind of the same type of archetype, but the bad side of it, or how it can become twisted. So for example, the nurturer character could become the over-controlling mother, or the hovering mother, the helicopter mom. You know, that's a way to take that archetype and then kind of twist it and make it a little darker. And this whole book kind of does that. And I really love it because it does break it down for you a little bit. And if you're trying to create characters and you're trying to, you know, create these dynamic characters, we're not all great at creating character. And sometimes you'll have this idea of your character, but you don't quite know where you want to go with them. This might be a way to help you organize your thoughts. So you can look at this, or you can get a book, or you can read, you know, different websites and stuff about the archetypes, and you can look at it and go, okay, I do have a character that I think is the caregiver. He or she is the Samwise Gamgee of my story. You know, what do they fear? What motivates them? What would they die for? What would they live for? You know, and this is like a overarching things. Obviously you can start inserting these kind of little things in there if you're answering those questions. So if you have the over controlling mother, what motivates her? Her children? Or is it fear? Is it fear that maybe bad things will happen to her kids? And is that because something happened in her past? So a good example of that character is in The Face on the Milk Carton, which is about a girl who was kidnapped. And she finds out, because her face is on a milk carton, that she had been kidnapped several years before. And it throws everything into turmoil. But when she does meet with her biological family, she finds out that because she had been kidnapped, her mother had become a very overbearing woman who didn't let her other children out of her sight because she was so afraid that they would be stolen, which makes her such an interesting in-depth character, even though she's really just a secondary character, but you understand those motivations because we recognize that fear as humans. And that's what you're trying to do when you're creating these characters. We are trying to create human characters that everybody can recognize. And it's okay if they're an archetype. It's okay if they're recognizable to us. It's also okay to really play around with those tropes sometimes. You have that hero who's very excited, but they've got a flaw. And they've got a flaw that makes it very difficult to be a hero. Or they've got something that they can't. It doesn't allow them to be a hero in the way that they wanted to be. I really think that archetypes are about getting your creative juices flowing. They're a way of analyzing what we've written and where we want to go, and making stories recognizable to our readers, but also making them our own. Part of our storytelling history, it as old as time, as long as people have been telling stories. Odysseus has an archetypal character. It's several of them actually. Archetypal characters are not bad. They are our storytelling history. They are a way to embrace the many thousands of years worth of storytelling that has come before us. And we as humans recognize these characters, and we kind of need them almost because they are part of us and part of our human psyche. And they allow us to recognize the characters and recognize where the author's going. And then the author can play around with it and make jump off points and really, do what they want to do, be experimental with it, and also I find the stories that do still follow some of these archetypes almost strictly, I still enjoy them, and I enjoy them because they're interesting and fun stories, and there's good plots, and there's character arcs, and those things are just as important. So I want you to think of archetypes as a jumping off point to really explore how to do character. And if you're really stuck, or you've got a character, you're like, I've got this great character, but they seem so perfect. They don't have any problems. Try to identify what their archetype is, and then identify what some of the flaws of that archetype might be, and some of the areas where they might struggle. And that might give you an idea where you can go with your story, and it might actually shape your story in a different way than what you were thinking. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel. We post new writing tips every Friday, well, almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.